William, nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you. I just go by Bill usually.
Okay. Hi, Bill. My name is Steve Lammy. I work at the USC.
Okay, well, good. Well, I'm glad you can make it.
Yeah, thanks.
Professor Lammy is our advisor for the Global Policy Institute. So
Oh, okay,
here.
great. Well, it seems like a great initiative. I'm glad you guys are doing it.
It's a great group of kids that are really interested in extending their own education on these issues, but also to helping the university understand some of these things. So it's a great place to share ideas, and we really want to thank you for agreeing to be part of this.
Well, I'm happy to do it. You know, I'm a fellow Trojan and got a daughter's there now. So, any way I can help, I'm glad to.
Oh, that's great. What is she studying here?
She's in the in Dornsife in the computational neuroscience.
Oh, wow. So no one ever sees her in computational neuroscience. She's basically working all the time, right?
Yeah, she's pretty hardcore.
Yeah.
Well, of course, and during pandemic, you can't see anybody anyway, unfortunately.
Is she around campus, or is she?
Yeah, she's actually living. Her and her roommates had a off-campus housing, so they're up there during the week.
Okay, makes sense. A lot of these guys are too.
All right, I think I'm going to give everyone about 3 more minutes to trickle in, and then we can get started.
Okay.
I've just been going over my 35 pages of notes from the debates last night. It was so thorough and comprehensive and content based.
I'm assuming you're being a little facetious.
No, that's not part of my qualities. It was just it's just unbelievable.
Yeah, I attempted to watch just again to see if there might be a nugget of something, but to be honest, it was so painful, I just couldn't do it.
I keep thinking about my parents telling me you have to be polite to our leaders and you have to be civil in your discourse. And I just saw everything that my parents taught me go away.
Yeah, exactly. Well, hopefully this generation doesn't learn that lesson, though.
Yeah. Wow, got a good group.
Okay, so I think just to be mindful of everyone's time, we're going to get started. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Delarai, and I'm a fellow here at the Global Policy Institute. We're a student-run think tank that focuses on important global issues and the policies that relate to them. And we examine these issues through research and program events like this one. And we are so excited to have all of you here for our first event in the election series. And we are also very excited to have Dr. Snyder here. Dr. Snyder served on the Presidential Council of Advisors on Science and Technology for the Clinton and H.W. Bush administrations. He also led the Ernst & Young China Center of Excellence in Cyber Breach financial impact analysis practices, in which he advised and briefed people from the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, the FBI, and the Department of Treasury, and people from various multinational corporations. He is also a fellow Trojan, so Dr. Snyder, whenever you're ready, feel free to share your screen and get us started.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks very much, Delora. I appreciate that, and I appreciate being invited by the group. As Delora just mentioned, I am a fellow Trojan, and so always excited to come back and talk to our Trojan community. I do want to point out, I'm actually not a doctor, not a PhD. I have my master's degree, but just want to make sure that that's clear. I'm not an academic or a PhD. So look, the topic that I was asked to share is a little bit, I think, about my background and what I've been doing, both specifically as it relates to what I would call international technology policy and as it relates to China. And I think the billing was a little bit broader than I may touch upon. You know, specifically on the U.S. election, I do want to talk about that a little bit. But in terms of the timing that we have, I'm going to try to keep it somewhat focused, because some of these issues are just, quite frankly, so deep and so complex that it just wouldn't make sense to try to go into too broad an area. And lastly, in terms of human rights, again, I may want to throw out a few questions to the group, since I know we have a strong, broad audience here. But my background really is in the technology areas, less so, or quite frankly, not at all on the human rights side. So I just want to point that out. I'm not really speaking from authority in those areas. And before I jump in, again, I think Delora did a nice job on giving a little bit about my background, but just, again, to help. Again, I began my career as an engineer from USC, Viterbi alumni. Was fairly quickly recruited by the U.S. government. And as she mentioned, I had 2 stints on the White House staff, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the Director of National Security Affairs. And then eventually I left the government, went back to the private sector, and really focused on cross-border technology issues. And in particular, I had a focus within China. So I spent 8 years based in China, running an investment bank and overseeing 3 different offices in Hong Kong, Beijing, and Shanghai. And then most recently at what was known as China House, which was our internal group within Ernst & Young, running a group of specialists that looked particularly at China technology-related issues and risks that they pose to the U.S. Commercial industrial supply chain, as well as the defense industrial supply chain. So anyway, that was a long-winded way of getting started, but hopefully I can share some interesting data. Again, I put together some slides that, quite frankly, are data and graphics heavy, and unfortunately the quality that I had put together I just went through a move from the West Coast or to the West Coast, so I don't have my highest quality graphics, so I apologize for that, but eventually I will send out another version which has higher quality graphics, which will make it a little easier to see, but hopefully they can be used as kind of starting points for the discussion, because I do like data-driven discussion points, which is a little bit rare in this day and age. All right, so let me go ahead and share here. All right, so can everybody see our screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Now, again, this is my narrowed down topic. Again, I'll try to touch on a number of things, particularly things as it touches on the election. I know that many of you and the Policy Institute has been trying to get an election series going. So I will mention that. But again, I did want to stay relatively brief given our time that we have and just given the complexities of some of these issues. So, when I think about these things and what might be of interest, I've been looking at technology strategy and what China has been doing for quite a number of years. And certainly it's been an area of interest in the US, both within various administrations and certainly up on the Hill for many years. I think what many observers see is there's certainly been a difference in emphasis on where to put time and pressure. And we'll talk a little bit about that and how that's evolved. And what I call what really seems to irk some folks in the administration, and why that might be. Again, let me talk a little bit about just what I'm thinking about as techno-nationalism. That's been, certainly a widely applied term throughout folks thinking about foreign policy and, looking back to former Soviet Union, as well as the rise within various parts of Asia, including Japan, and certainly has been applied to China as well. For those of you who may be interested, there's a wonderful friend who's a professor down at UCSD, Tai-Ming Chung, who's just done some excellent work, has some great writings that if those of you that are interested in looking, I highly recommend checking out some of the work that he's done. Again, depending upon the background of individuals in the group, I think some of you at least may be familiar that industrial planning in a general sense has certainly been a pillar within the PRC's economic development strategy, and that's been the case for multiple decades. Traditionally, that had been in more traditional industrial areas, heavy industries, chemicals, and then over time that has evolved. And I think that you saw the biggest bright line of evolution in the post-WTO period. So right about the turn of the century, you started to see the various arms within the PRC government, NDRC, but other players begin to really emphasize science and technology and the role that it should be playing within that development. And I think to some extent that really took off over the past decade. So if you think about the end of the last Chinese administration and the beginning of the Xi administration, the ideas of bringing in indigenous innovation as part of China's strategy, trying to wean themselves off foreign technology and foreign sources, both in terms of leading edge technology, but also in terms of realistically being able to expand their manufacturing base and in other areas. And in particular, during that decade, this past decade, there has been much more specificity in terms of what the Chinese have laid out. And we'll talk about a couple of those because, again, there's a whole breadth and depth of industrial strategies that China has launched upon. And again, I think many of those deserve great attention and certainly have gained attention from the US. But I'm just going to talk about a couple of them, things like semiconductors, artificial intelligence, which are very broad-based, and a non-industry focus, but military-civil fusion, which again is something that had been around, the idea of trying to leverage civilian and military capabilities. That's certainly something that's been prevalent within the US for years, and China has certainly had aspirations of doing that for at least several decades. But I think Xi Jinping had taken that to a new level and focused, and specifically in terms of reorganizing certain state-owned enterprises and putting incentive programs to start really taking advantage of potential areas in both what people call spin-on and spin-off technologies. In other words, going both from the commercial side to enhance military capabilities, or where there are military advances that are beyond commercial areas to support those areas. Now, I guess a theme that I would say that I think I would want to discuss as we go forward is, number one, there's certainly been a shift in terms of where the U.S. responses or concerns or time spent in thinking about China has been since Trump took office. Historically, if you think about where a lot of the emphasis has been, it's been in human rights issues. It's certainly been in trade, and within that, intellectual property protection. It's certainly been in areas that deal with Xinjiang and other areas of human rights concerns. And what seems to be clear is that has been de-emphasized. I can't say that it's been totally neglected since Trump came office, but there certainly has been more focus on other areas. And I think for many China watchers, it's been difficult to identify whether all these pieces fit into a grand strategy. And to be honest, I think I'm being generous there. I don't know that many people believe that there is a grand strategy behind many of these elements. And if you look at them in a piecemeal basis, a lot of them appear haphazard, and in many cases, somewhat knee-jerk responses, either to short-term situations or as some sort of opening salvo in terms of taking a strong position prior to the opening of negotiations with the hope that something moves forward. And I think, unfortunately, we haven't seen a lot of where that negotiation tactic may have actually worked or come through. So let's again just talk about some of the specific of what these call techno-nationalist policies. Again, that if you think about that, that really is meant to be saying using science and technology in a framework to achieve certain domestic goals. And they can be economic goals, they can be military goals, they can be a mix of those. And certainly China is not the first group to attempt to utilize various types of these strategies. But they certainly have been very prolific, certainly if you think over the past decade. So one area that's gained an enormous amount of attention, certainly even before the Trump administration, but also since the beginning of the Trump administration, is artificial intelligence. And the PRC has put out a plethora of various action plans, and some quite detailed. These are multi-agency plans involving MIT, Ministry of Education. There's funding mechanisms that span both central government as well as local and provincial funding centers. And so it is without a doubt a very broad-based and funded effort. I mean, it's certainly more than what you would see from certain past strategies that had some good ideas but lacked a lot of the funding or the cohesion or the broad collaboration, or should I say at least the broad coordination. Mentioned a bit earlier military-civil fusion. Again, that concept of civil-military integration or military-civil fusion has been around. It's a wide technology development strategy where countries have at least a strong military, or at least hope to have one, and a commercial base. Xi Jinping has put much greater emphasis on it. He has spoken about the importance of this on numerous occasions, and again has put more than words behind it. In particular, there's been a series of action plans, as somewhat are shown here, and again, trying to specify down through the various central and local and provincial level agencies the importance of making this work, the importance of the benefits that either local leaders, whether they be on the civilian side within the Chinese government or on the military side, in terms of thinking about ongoing promotion, and really coordinating in terms of finding things like funding sources. So not just traditional government money, although that's there, but also bringing in the private sector. That's certainly a key pillar of the civil fusion part. It's not just the technology on the commercial side that is looking for, it's the management techniques, it is the funding mechanisms that would be adopted. So whether that's venture capital or private equity or things that would allow reform and more efficiency on the military side. Again, I keep raising this because these are things without a doubt that has raised the alarm bells, both within the administration, within Congress. I think bipartisan groups would agree that there's things here at least that need to be looked at and observed and monitored. As I said, these efforts have grown from simply policy plans to very specific, in this case, showing demonstration zones. So look, you can see that it's widely geographically dispersed across China in almost all the provinces, ranging from a whole spectrum of technologies. They're clearly linked to various military installations and research centers and research development institutes, but also in commercial centers. So down in Suzhou and near Hangzhou and down in Shanghai, and of course in Shenzhen, other areas where, again, there has been very specific action and activity to put these policies into effect, and certainly progress being made. Companies being formed, joint ventures being formed, being funded, and eventually products coming out the next day. Let me switch a little bit, but I'll try to tie that back to what we just mentioned. So again, I'm a data guy, and I apologize. This is about a data heavy and unfortunately not the clearest video, but it's something that I think is another way to look at whether these risks are real and why folks may be concerned about it and what, if anything, can be done about it. So I think everyone may be aware that 5G was and remains an enormously hot topic within the government these days. Again, it has been for quite some time, certainly within the DoD realm, but gaining on a broader realm. And what I want to show here, first of all, what you're looking at here, this is what's known as a patent topography. And essentially what it is showing is the density and relationships between research areas within patents that are being filed. And the idea is that you can use these topographical maps to see where there tends to be a lot of activity, in what technology areas they are, who's doing it, like in which company or which country, and where there are gaps or overlaps. And it's the gaps and overlaps that tend to be either of concern or interest to governments, because they tend to illustrate areas of weakness for various applications, or areas for targeting if theft is going to be a potential issue. This particular graph is looking a little bit historically back at 4G, and I did that. Some of the analysis that I've worked on before within 5G is unfortunately still classified, but I think the 4G look gives you an idea to think about what's happening here. So again, 4G was the prior research or telecom standard for mobile technology and communications, it was certainly an area where the US and the West had been very successfully leading. And again, if you think about these patent topography maps, in these cases, the colorings are showing certain companies which have a dominant area here. And in particular, everybody, or at least some of you may remember Research in Motion. So back in the BlackBerry days, and I suspect some of the students may not remember the BlackBerry days, but it wasn't that long ago, where RIM and BlackBerry essentially controlled all the technology, and which still in some cases plays an important part in current communications. And so that's the red areas, and you can see a very, very broad mix and highly dense, meaning very strong positions within certain technologies within the 4G spectrum. Apple and Nortel are minor players at this point. You can certainly see where Apple is down at the bottom yellow. But really, when this was done, this highlighting in the middle, that purple oval that you see, that's really the green area, is what was Nortel Networks. And at the time, Nortel was essentially being auctioned off for their technologies and patents. And that was considered the treasure trove, the crown jewels of 4G were being licensed off. And if you think about it, certainly countries, corporate acquirers, and certainly governments do these same types of analysis to look at where their gaps are for technology. Where do they need to add? And so in this case, both Apple and other groups went into a consortium and acquired the 4G technology assets. Now, the concern would be within 5G of doing the same type of analysis, who has some of the critical 5G technologies, who controls them, and where do the risks lie? And can, either through acquisitions or joint ventures, could potential adversaries, and I'll go ahead and say China, access those technologies? And in my view, the Trump administration has spent a lot of time thinking about this and working on this, but in some sense, the boat had already sailed. Again, without going into detail, it's fairly broad public information. If you look at a similar patent topography for 5G, you would essentially see that companies like Huawei dominate. They're very broad-based, they're very dense, and there are other pockets where there's Western companies that do control certain portions of 5G technology, but it's limited, and the overlap is limited. And that tells you a couple things. One, the US can't afford to be taking a protectionist strategy if they're not really the leader in 5G technology. And so I would argue some of the reactions that they've taken on 5G, whether it's entity lists or blacklists, can play certain roles and may have certain benefits, but in some cases are totally insufficient, because if the US is unable to develop its own independent capabilities, or other Western companies, they're not going to be able to make up the deficit. And similarly, if these strategies are in some sense just simply too late, whether someone's thinking about going to 6G or not, whether we're trying to keep companies or somehow protect and get US networks or international networks that don't use Chinese technology, it's an extraordinarily difficult task. At a minimum, it's going to put 5G rollouts on a much slower pace than they otherwise would have been. And number two, in some cases, it may not just be technically feasible in realistic timeframes to get what at least the DoD folks would concern trusted, verified technology within the supply chains. And again, that's not to play down the risks. The risks of using these types of technologies, whether it's Huawei or others, in terms of cyber threats, is known, and there are certainly things that cannot be ignored. But again, the solution, I think, needs to be much broader than some of the tit for tat activities that we've seen from Trump. Another thing I wanted to talk about is some of the mobile apps. So there's a slightly different issue. If you think about mobile apps, and again, you can pick TikTok and WhatsApp as being an example. So this is a similar patent topography in the chat space, so mobile chat space, and in particular, this is one company. And again, it's important to think about these because the Trump administration has put a lot of emphasis on trying to prevent either R&D partnerships with key leaders in these areas or acquisitions in using and implementing CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., and then its follow-on under FIRMA, to try to protect technologies like this. And so, move here, this is, again, a very complex one, but again, hopefully you can just get the idea without seeing some of the details. This is the much broader space within mobile technology. And the company that I just illustrated in the prior slide is what's down in the yellow oval. So you can see that really it has a dominant position within that particular area, but it really is only one piece of the whole mobile chat space. There's a much broader area of technology. There's many nodes that are particularly important. And in this case, at least at this point in time, you can see that Skype and its relative entities control the vast majority of that. So white dots here are Skype, and there's other players there. But if the US was considering wanting to protect technology, there's certain companies that they would need to think about, and whether they're US companies and they would be able to do that is another issue. Now, I think, again, people that have looked at the TikTok case and the WhatsApp case, that wasn't the rationale that the administration had cited. It was more of a national security concern over the gathering of personal information from these apps. And again, there's certainly consensus that mobile apps in general are collecting enormous amounts of data on not only Americans, but individuals around the world. And that has implications, and it certainly has risks. What isn't clear, and what the Trump administration didn't make clear, is why WhatsApp or TikTok were really different. In other words, in the data that they were collecting, they did not elucidate any specifics, other than to say that there was at least some connections with these entities, either through ByteDance or other areas, with the Communist Party itself, and made a few leaps in their argument to get to that. Because these companies could gather data, they could share with the Communist Party, and therefore were risks. Of course, that same argument could be applied to almost any Chinese mobile app, or many other types of apps. So not just mobile apps, but if you think about the Internet of Things and appliances or self-driving vehicles, all of those areas will similarly be areas of concern. And again, will there attempt to be made that there's national security concerns? And I think most Americans would agree that this same data, if not more data, is being gathered already by many US companies or other foreign companies. And perhaps the better strategy for addressing these is not under unilateral onesie-twosie actions against companies like TikTok and WhatsApp, but as a much broader strategy using multilateral organizations, using a variety of groups where a consensus can be developed that's much stronger, and really addresses some of the more fundamental issues than we may have seen. And I think the judge already has pointed out in both those cases for WhatsApp and TikTok that the national security argument is probably weak and not sufficiently to justify those areas. Again, a couple of things. Again, I try to balance, because I do agree that there are risks and threats that are posed by some of these techno-national strategies within China. There's definitely evidence in certain situations. I think where it certainly has gone perhaps to the area of xenophobia, or quite frankly of just economic jealousy, where Chinese companies have gained an advantage legitimately through legitimate competition that the interests have not been served well by actions during the administration. So this is another type of example where I just wanted to point out back to the military civil fusion area, because again, so many of the technologies that we think about today, whether it's artificial intelligence, quantum computing or quantum communications, things like industrial robotics, there is a great deal of commercial and military overlap. And so one way to think about, and certainly one way the government has been thinking about, is looking at where there are overlaps within these research areas and seeing what China has been doing, what the US has been doing. Are there threats? Are there opportunities? Are there gaps in research? And what that can tell you from what is usually at least somewhat objective data. For example, here is a specific case where there were identified areas of commercial and civil use. This had to do with atomic frequency clocks, which are very common within things like communications. The U.S. GPS system and China's Beidou both use atomic frequency standards to run, and both for commercial and military application. They're critical. And this graphic that you're looking at, again, a pretty nasty and hard to decipher graphic, but let me just give you the gist. Essentially, using these patent trees, you can look at the evolution of technology and where things are coming from. And in this particular case, some of the original leaders within these atomic frequency clocks, which are so common both in the commercial and military realms, arose from a handful of patents, Honeywell, among other US leaders. And then you can see the branching out, and in particular, the emphasis within various branches from the Chinese side. So both the pink and the yellow boxes are highlighting various Chinese research institutes. So some of these are directly military research institutes. Some are commercial entities, but they're all related to military civil fusion demonstration sites. And so the point is, these things are real. Now, the question certainly can be raised, what if any theft occurred here? Was it simply leveraging existing technology through normal commercial means? I think those things are still open to debate. There's certainly situations where theft has been identified as clearly being the source, and again, there are ways of identifying and looking at the path and seeing exactly what may or may not have happened. Again, I'm cognizant that we didn't have a whole lot of time, so I apologize if I kind of went fast over some pretty complex graphs, but I did want to open it up because I realize this group is pretty strong in terms of its background, and I'd like to hear some of their feedback, because, you know, again, I have my own biases on what has been done and where some of the pitfalls have been. I'm curious to hear some of the feedback on what are some of the other policy tools that could be applied, and whether it's using multilateral institutions, it's using things besides entity lists or blacklists that might increase the effectiveness of whatever objective the U.S. is attempting. What we might expect for a China policy in a Biden administration, again, my thoughts are, in some sense, it may not look that different from initially from what Trump has. The Trump policies, again, have been somewhat haphazard. Some of it looks more traditionally Democrat than, tariffs and some of the things that have been done are more historically a democratically driven area. So I think a Biden administration would need to do a little bit of tiptoeing and figuring out the best way forward. But I think without a doubt, pushing away from unilateralism and pushing toward multilateral activity, looking for areas of consensus, re-engaging to the extent possible, and trying to bring in a broader policy. So whether it's these type of technology areas back in with the broader questions of human rights, or the South China Sea, or Taiwan, or other areas where, again, it's easier to get a broad international consensus to pressure China. All right, so again, let me throw it back. Delora, I don't know if we have any questions that came up, or you just want to throw it open to the group. I'm happy to.
Yeah, I have a question. If you would like, you could stop sharing your screen now too, just so we can see everyone when they ask their questions. And if anyone has a question, please feel free to raise your little blue hand, or you can just type it out in the chat. And we can go a little bit broader in our questions too. But so I was just wondering your opinion on this. I know that Pompeo has mentioned a little bit, but do you think that there'll be a difference in the ways that Trump and Biden will approach Hong Kong and some of the human rights violations going on there with protesters?
Well, of course, they have spoken. They issued an executive order on Hong Kong. My feeling, and again, I haven't queried that many specialists on it, but my friends in Hong Kong would argue that they felt so far the Trump administration has not been very strong in speaking out against that or taking much action, with the idea that they still may be holding out for a trade deal or using that as a negotiation tactic during a trade deal after the election. Looking back from, again, the record on, if you think back to early days of Biden during either the Obama administration or earlier in his career in the Senate, and during Tiananmen Square, he was certainly active. I believe it likely that they would take at least a stronger approach, and particularly potentially in the nearer term, because I think there's more incentive for them to go after those issues where, again, they can get international support and use that as openings to get a broader coalition together. But I haven't seen that much directly out of Biden over the past few months, specifically about what they would do, whether it's Hong Kong or somewhere else.
All right, thank you. Mia, would you like to ask your question now?
Yeah, hi, Bill. Thank you for your presentation. I have a specific question about U.S. China competition and techno-nationalism, kind of what you touched on. So to my understanding, like about a generation ago, the U.S. was really the, technological driver of the world. And I feel like now, as you kind of touched upon and as I read upon in classes, like China now has like the most amount of patents and is really pushing ahead in innovation. It's also my understanding that while the Chinese government does a better job of like merging the gap between government and technology firms, the U.S. government has grown increasingly opposed to tech firms or big tech. So I wanted to ask, do you think that the idea that American government and American tech are increasingly opposed, do you think this is a result of greater American political culture, or do you think that this is just a newer posture as a result of the current administration? And I think it kind of touched upon your second discussion question that you posed, but do you think that the U.S. could possibly reverse course? And in the future, do you see us moving towards a situation in which tech and government are not so opposed and more so blended? Okay,
well, let me try to address what I can from those. First, I'm not sure, at least what may have come across for me. I am not one of the believers that China has taken the lead in a broad swath of areas of technology. I think they've made enormous strides in certain areas. And again, if you think about artificial intelligence or, well, certainly quantum computing, industrial robotics, additive manufacturing. However, there are certainly many, many areas where the U.S. and the West, other Western nations, I think have a very strong position. Although again, China has caught up in many ways. So I mean, I would not be as dire as some, for example, as Mr. Navarro in the administration, who tends to be a little more dire than almost anybody I know. And while I agree to some extent your comment that there certainly is tension, for at least what I see, between certain elements within the U.S. government and certain tech companies. I don't think that's, I don't think that it's terribly broad-based. Again, I think there are areas where there's at least reasonable coordination. I do agree. There's some areas, again, on data, as we already talked about, that there needs to be a lot of work done, and the government, I think, needs to take a stronger role in oversight and regulating. And again, not just a U.S. approach. I think it needs to be a broad, global, multilateral approach for some of those things. I will say, again, what I think is missing, or at least one area that's missing, I think we could do a better job of taking some of the paths that China has done. In other words, going back to what had been somewhat stylish 25 years ago, which was thinking about U.S. technology policy and U.S. industrial strategy. And that became a little bit out of favor in various administrations. I think the environments are different than they used to be. And again, there was a AI document released within the Obama administration and a follow-up that the Trump administration had laid out. In my view, those did not go very far. But I think in order for the U.S., again, because we are at a minimum playing in a much stronger field, and as you say, there are areas where we are potentially and certainly not leading, we need to take a more aggressive offensive strategy. And so whether that's things like strengthening investment in university education, things that have always been strong points in the U.S., working more on getting government, university, and private sector cooperation within certain technology areas, I think those things can go a long way. And I just think we seem to have left that part of the toolbox silent for too long. So I would hope we could do that, and whichever administration hopefully will start doing some of those things.
Thank you.
Thank you. Matt, do you want to ask your question now?
Yeah, thanks for being here, Mr. Snyder. My question is specifically about Huawei and 5G. And you mentioned that the US has been sort of blacklisting and rejecting Huawei and other Chinese tech without really presenting an alternative for ourselves or our allies. And so my question is, do you think moving forward, in order to strengthen the US's anti-Chinese tech stance, we need to invest more in American 5G tech that we can have as an alternative?
Well, I think that's the implicit hope in these entity lists. And again, I've had a number of commercial clients in the 5G space. Some of the gap, I mean, there is without a doubt areas where the US and Western companies can catch up or at least participate in reasonable lengths of time. I think there's other areas, and unfortunately some fundamental areas within 5G that if you think of where we would need to be to have similar types of products, it's just too long. It's on the order of several years. And again, these 5G rollouts are already occurring. So the trade-off becomes, whether it's in the commercial or military side, do we simply want to wait that long? And what do we do in the meantime until we do that? Do we take some level of risk? In other words, is there some sort of middle ground where we, and again, obviously, I think that answer would be different in different industries and certainly different among civilian versus military. But I would also argue, in some sense, the genie's out of the bottle. And I think this has been a common premise that, whether you're talking cyber threats or specific things like Trojan horses within 5G, if you think of the span of where we're at now with the Internet of Things, with mobile technology, and the sophistication of cyber players, the idea of risk-free systems are a thing of the past, if there ever were such a thing. And so I think in some sense, it will be various leaders or entities within those different groups deciding how to play in that type of arena, how to just accept those risks as part of the game, and whether there's ways around it through things like quantum encryption or something like that, I don't know. But I think, again, the genie's out of the bottle in certain cases, and so I think the U.S. Just can't afford to wait and do nothing. I just think there's just too many areas where it's just the development time and the capacity, whether it's manufacturing or design capabilities, to somehow recreate that, and the economic incentives to do that are non-trivial. And so, whether you got something that was highly inefficient and that didn't last very long, you would run into all the arguments of why the technology strategy didn't make sense 25 years ago. And again, I'm not one of those people, but I think if you go down that path, you end up getting there.
All right, Jonathan, would you like to ask your question now?
Thank you for your presentation, sir. As you said, the Trump administration's approach to China has, been chaotic and haphazard. Now, one area that I do see consensus in, that is in the administration's specific efforts to counter Huawei in, for example, the chip industry. Now, I think you might have an opinion about this, but Huawei right now is essentially starving of chips, whether it's, I believe it was September is their last month, where their stockpile of chips is running out. It may take a decade potentially or more for them to be able to produce them themselves. They're just not small enough. And I see, Huawei as, they were on set to be the #1 cell phone manufacturer, and it's taken a huge step backwards. What does this success mean? And I'm always looking for updates about this, but there doesn't seem to be enough information about it. What can you tell us about this, and what are the consequences, I guess, for Huawei, and anything else you have that you can share about this?
Okay. Well, let me throw out a couple things. One, you're right. I think, well, there certainly has been a great deal of focus on Huawei. I think, I'm not sure I would categorize it as a broad coordinated effort, but a broad effort to within hardware. And you're right, without a doubt, it has an impact on Huawei. I'm not sure, from what I've seen, the 10-year impact is as long as it's going to be before they're able to. Huawei would, say months. I think that's not realistic. I'm not sure it's going to be 10 years. Again, if you look at the semiconductor industry and where they're at, there are certain areas where they're that far back, but there's other areas where they're not. And the question is, will it take them that long to catch up? But the bigger concern, quite frankly, that I've had all along is, well, a couple things. Some of the chip companies that we've prevented from selling to Huawei. For example, Qualcomm, one of our bright companies, 70% of their revenue came from China. And a great portion of that came from Huawei. And so, and similarly to other chip companies, we are hurting those companies too. And the question is, can we make sure that those companies are profitable, that continue to invest, can make toward the next generation, or are we unwittingly putting some of those companies at risk? And of course, for all the Qualcomms, which are fairly big and visible, there's a whole lot of second and third tier companies, or even mom and pop companies that are selling components or machinery or things like that would also be part of the ban, that are now struggling because Huawei was so big and buying so much of the market. And again, to the extent that the entity list broadens, that's going to have an impact too. And so it's not to say that there may be support and rationale for those types of blacklisting. I just, for certain, it works for the Chinese argument that they need to be self-sufficient. They need to have their indigenous innovation. So within the domestic arena within China, it allows them to say, we can't afford this. This is absolutely why we need to do this. So that feeds into their own argument, which I'm not sure is exactly what the Navarros of the world really want. But second, in the short term or in the near term, there's real economic cost on the suppliers who were selling to the Huawei's, the other blacklisted companies. And so, whether you're somehow replacing that revenue or making sure those companies don't take too rough an impact in the meantime, and again, continue to invest, because otherwise, not only were we not in the lead, or if we were in the lead, all of a sudden we're going to lose the lead because Qualcomm was investing X billions of dollars prior to this, and now they can only afford a tenth of that. So I just think that there may be some unintended consequences that we need to make sure we keep an eye on.
Okay, and I think, Cricket, if you want to be our final question, and then we can wrap it up from there.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for, coming talking to us today. It's been really awesome to listen to you. So I think there's been some concern among the U.S. administration about China's social credit system when it comes to citizens' privacy. Would you say do you see any comparison between the SCS surveillance and data collection systems and say Facebook or other tech corporations? Would it be fair to say the primary difference is the data collection surveillance is government driven in China, where it's privately driven here?
Yeah, let me caveat by saying social credit is probably not my best area of roundhouse, but I can say this. If you want to read, Elsa Kania has some great information about that, among others. But I think it is fair to say the government in China has certainly been leading the way. While I was there, so while I was doing my banking work within China, Tyco Security Products was living the dream, quite frankly, because every local and municipal government across the country was buying their surveillance technology and their facial recognition and all sorts of great things. And if you incorporate AI, you can see how powerful those things are. But I would say I don't think it's exclusively the government. I think that there are commercial applications. There are commercial areas where, again, if you think back to that military civil fusion area, where there's technology involved in social credit monitoring that go both ways, and so not just government entities are interested in that. And then if you think about where the U.S. is, again, I would say historically, it's probably true that some of these surveillance technologies may be, maybe it's always been a mixed bag on whether it's law enforcement agencies or other groups, and how much the central or federal government here would want to get involved I think would scare a lot of people. Again, from a technology standpoint, I think the things that we're all most concerned about is that type of mechanism mixed with the power of artificial intelligence, because all of a sudden that massive amounts of data on individuals or corporations can be analyzed and ranked and scored without human input, and quite frankly, without even knowing the consequences with artificial systems. So I think this is an area where certainly from a human rights standpoint, it makes sense for the U.S. to be involved globally and multilaterally, and hopefully that's something that can take place. But it's the social credit system has so many facets to it that I think it's a fabulous conversation that you guys should have with another speaker, because I think there's a whole lot of things there that are certainly very scary and mind-opening.
All right, so I think we're gonna wrap it up here. Thank you so much, Mr. Snyder. Mia has put the link to the GPI website in the chat. We also have a very exciting event tomorrow, and we have another event next week for our election series on Wednesday, and all that information will be emailed out. Also, please remember to register to vote and check your voting registration, because it is important that we all participate in this election. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you. Fight on.